Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 137, The First Settler to Officially Discover Gold in Australia. Part 2. In this episode, I'm going to be covering the point at which Edward Hargraves discovers gold and the political football that occurs in regards to recognition for his gold find. During this time, he followed a course discussed with Davison in trying to get government support for his prospecting journey. He approached his friend Peake and his solicitor Norton, both of whom were unimpressed. He publicised his project to many others, including William Spain, the Police Inspector General, the City Surveyor, Mr. Bryant, and Norton at least did give Edward a letter of introduction to my friend Isley, who did get specks of gold in quartz on his property at Cooming. Around the end of January, Norton wrote to Dees Thompson, the Colonial Secretary, on behalf of Edward. Sydney, 23rd of January 1851. Mr. Hargraves of Brisbane Water, with whom I have had a long acquaintance, has just returned from California with slender means but large experience. He professes to be able to discover gold wherever it exists, I trust, by means employed by the miners of California only, and would be very ready to operate upon your quartz and the land and any other place from its appearance indicating the presence of gold. He is a most endearing person and I think admirably fitted to undergo labour that would belong to a month's investigation. Mr. Hargraves is not, however, able to bear the expense of going on the 5 or 6 week residence in the country, but if you like to support means to cover his expenses, he will visit. I think you cannot do better than this, Jane Norton. The offer was declined, but Dees Thompson was interested to know that Edward planned to visit Isley. Davison stated that Edward had used the proceeds from the sale of his gold to settle his wife's debts, as she'd been running the store at Brisbane Water. Davison also identified Alderman William Northwood as the man that lent Edward £100 so that he could outfit himself for the journey west. This was lent on the condition of repayment of half of any reward and information about the location so Northwood could buy up the land. The letters to William Northwood on the 11th and 16th of February 1851 by Edward Hargraves state, at Wellington Inn, Guyong, 11th of February 1851. Dear Sir, I arrived here last evening. The weather was exceedingly hot, indeed nearly as much so as in California. I am scarcely 250 miles from Sydney. I'm now going to the Macquarie River and trace up the source of Ballanturin rivers, a distance of 150 miles. I will strike the Macquarie 20 miles from Wellington and Bunalong, and I have got hopes of success, but the scarcity of water will prevent my making such a research as I should wish. You will not hear from me for 3 weeks or a month. It is superfluous for me to say that my most undivided energies will be directed towards the object in view. I have been over a country of 30 to 40 miles abounding with copper. The resources of this country are little known, and it is no doubt a rich mining country, and new discoveries will be made every day. You had better send £200 of flour up to the house in a fortnight and write me about the same time, giving me what news you can, address Post Office Bathurst. I shall then know how things are going on. I am now at the world's end and I'm going 200 miles beyond it. A little news will be acceptable. When I come into the world again, I met Mr. Isley as he was coming up from Sydney. He was going down and gave me a very pressing invitation to go to his house at Cooming, and I did not go. I may call in coming back if I want to rest the horse. Don't forget to speak to Mr. Sutter, as I shall be regularly stumped by the time I get to Bathurst. In haste, yours truly, E. H. Hargraves. Edward set off for his journey on the 5th of February and firstly went to Guyong, where Captain John Lister's widow kept a hotel. Taking what he thought was a shortcut, he got lost in Fredericks Valley, later a profitable gold area, and did not get to Guyong until the 10th of February. Susan Lister didn't recognise her visitor at first, but soon remembered the cabin boy on board her late husband's ship. The Listers had fallen on hard times. The captain had continued his shipping interest, but by September 1838, the Lister family settled in Sydney, where Captain Lister set up as a shipping agent. However, his business ventures were unsuccessful, and within 5 years he was declared insolvent and they lost all their family possessions and property. He returned to life at sea as captain of a schooner, the Perseverance, But in February 1844, the ship became stranded in the South Channel at Moreton Bay and eventually became a total wreck. In 1846, the captain became the licence of the Robin Hood and the Little John Inn at the Rocks on Wellington Road between Bathurst and Orange. But in July 1850, misfortune again struck the listers when the 46-year-old captain was accidentally killed when he fell from his wagon near Bathurst. By just a year, he missed out on all of the relative prosperity brought on by the gold rush. So Susan moved further west to Guyong, where she took over the licence of the Wellington Inn, and Hargraves arrived at the inn some 7 months after the captain's death. And he was said to have noticed mantelpiece rock samples that were collected from the local area by Susan's son John Jr., a young man of almost 23. These he suspected of being gold-bearing, and young John suggested that he could guide him to a place where he thought gold might be found. Hargraves' intended journey to Wellington was, for the moment, postponed, and the scene was now set for the great discovery. On the morning of the 12th of February 1851, with a pack horse and supplies provided by the Wellington Inn and accompanied by the young John Lister, Hargraves proceeded down to Lewis Ponds Creek, a point 4 kilometres upstream from Yorkeys Corner. There, at the junction of Lewis Ponds Creek and Radigan's Gully, Hargraves told Lister, "Where you walk over now is gold." The summer had been exceedingly hot, and other creek beds in the area dried up. So a few miles upstream from Yorkeys Corner, where a dike created a pool, they crossed the creek bed and stopped. Edward washed 6 panfuls of dirt from the top of the dike and got a speck in each of the first 5. This discovery yielded the famous sentence that he, Hargraves, would be made a baronet, Lister would be knighted, and his horse would be stuffed and sent to the British Museum. They gathered the few specks in a screw of notepaper and then went back to the hotel. That night Edward wrote in a memorandum, "Wednesday, 12th day of February 1851. Discovered gold this day. Named the diggings Hargraves, who is the first discoverer in New South Wales of that metal in the earth in a similar manner as found in California. This is a memorable day." He took the piece to the Empire newspaper and wrote, "Gold discovered in the alluvial at Lewis Ponds Creek on the 12th of February 1851. Edward and Lister, together with James Thom, the local parson's son, now set off on a journey along the Macquarie River from near Burrangong back to its junction with Summerhill Creek and thence back to Guyong. Numerous pans of earth showed colour, but not in the eyes of Thom and Lister, who wanted payable gold. Edward was prospecting. He washed only to find colour to determine the possible extent of a goldfield. When Edward got back to Guyong, he wrote to Isley on the 20th of February, stating that portions of Lewis Ponds Creek and Macquarie River would pay 7 to 10 shillings a day just by panning. He then went on to Wellington and Dubbo, finding show in many places. When he got back to Guyong on the 15th of March, Lister and Thom showed him the granular gold that they had got from the Turon and some 40 specks that they found below Yorkeys Corner. Hargraves now showed them how to make a cradle, a much more efficient way of washing the earth away more quickly. Lister and Thom claimed that in 1853 Edward urged them to keep any discovery secret so as to not precipitate a rush that would be harmful to the labour situation. Edward left for Sydney, arriving on the 20th of March. He'd found what he had set out to do, though hampered by the dry summer. He was following his original plan of taking his discovery to the government, hoping to impress them that the few specks were evidence of payable goldfields. His request to Lister and Thom for secrecy was not so much to stop a rush, but to forestall any rush before he could make his claim. His anxiety was probably increased with the knowledge that there were several returned California miners in Bathurst. While in Sydney, with the sole intention of naming himself as the great discoverer of gold and indicating that a £500 reward was warranted, he secretly informed the Colonial Secretary, Edward Dease Thompson, of his find. Hargraves was told to put his claim in writing. The Colonial Secretary was not overly impressed by a few specks of gold, but he was interested in the likelihood of a large goldfield. Over 2 more meetings, Edward expressed his willingness to reveal the location provided, as long as he was promised a reward. The Colonial Secretary's response, dated on the 5th of April, said, "In reply to your letter on the 3rd, I am directed by the Governor to inform you that His Excellency cannot say more at present than that the remuneration of the discovery of gold on Crown lands referred to by you must entirely depend on its nature and the value when made known, and must be left to the liberal consideration which the Government would be disposed to give it." Meanwhile, Edward had met Rudder, who had been wrecked on the journey from California, and Rudder later claimed that Edward spent his time trying to organise private parties to dig for gold. If Edward did so, he probably went to his friend Peake, who already had an interest in the Bathurst Copper Mining Company. In an effort to persuade the government that action was necessary, Edward and Rudder composed a letter that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 4th of April. In it, Rudder announced, "A goldfield has been discovered extending over part of the country about 300 miles in length. I have seen the specimens that have been procured, and from what I know, I have no doubt that gold will be found distributed over as wide, if not larger, spaces than in California." It was not until William Tom Jr. and John Lister made their significant finds between the 7th and the 12th of April that proof of a payable field was obtained. It fell to Rudder rather than Hargraves to go public about the finds, and there was a heated and rather entertaining series of correspondence that was published in the Sydney Morning Herald. On the 2nd of April, 1851, "Gentlemen, a goldfield has been discovered extending over a tract of country about 300 miles in length. The discovery has been made by a gentleman, an old well-known colonist, with whom I had the pleasure to travel many hundred miles when in California, and I know him to be a miner of very considerable experience. I trust it will be not long before the government will adopt without delay such measures as shall tend further to develop the riches of this colony and enable the people to reap the golden harvest which now appears to invite attention. I remain, gentlemen, your obedient servant, E.W. Rudder, Sydney." On the 3rd of May, "Gentlemen, in this morning's Herald I find the following statement. It is no longer any secret that gold has been found in the earth by Mr. E.H. Hargraves. While in California, Mr. Hargraves felt persuaded that, from the similarity of the geological formation, there must be gold in several districts of this colony, and when he returned, his expectations were realised. There are two asseverations, one as to the date of the first discovery of gold in this colony, the other as to the method by which Mr. Hargraves is asserted to have made that discovery. The object of this letter is to deny Mr. Hargraves the merit of the first discovery, or that he is the first person that led to the conclusion the similarity of the formation in California and New South Wales indicating a presence of gold. I almost wonder how you could have forgotten the many articles connected with this very subject that have been published long ago, I believe before Mr. Hargraves went to California, in which a comparison was insinuated. Now, as to the assertion that it was on the 12th of February 1851 that the said fact was established, you will turn to your own files, you'll discover that on the 28th of September 1847, the geological formation of this colony was investigated and mentions distinctly the existence of gold. Some of that gold is still in my possession. Mr. Hargraves has therefore merely acted upon suggestions thrown out years ago, and he has therefore no claim as the discoverer. There are numerous localities in which gold has been found in this colony, but is the government to pay every individual who picks up a handful of it? And on the 12th of May, "Gentlemen, in reply to the letter which appeared in your paper on the 5th, headed The Gold Discovery, I have to remark it appears to me to show about as much wisdom as that established by those jealous of that great discoverer Columbus, who, though they could not doubt the truth of his discoveries, found it impossible to make an egg stand on one end. No sooner, however, was the thing accomplished than they had the mortification to find it ridiculously simple. Mr. Hargraves never doubted that others had discovered gold, but could they profit from their discoveries? No, not one of them. Who has done this? Who was the first to show the hidden riches of this vast country? Mr. Hargraves. I question if the writer ever discovered anything. Like the bloated frog in the fable who envied the noble ox, the writer of the letter in question has only displayed the fact that his attempts at detraction and his desire to have it inferred he had in some way been injured by Mr. Hargraves' announcement must burst, and in doing so reduce him to a mere nothingness which has induced him to act with so much ill taste as to attempt wantonly to detract from the meritorious act of a fellow colonist. I am, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Fair Play. P.S. I can assure him I have handled some of the gold of Ophir and seen a specimen of platina found with it. Nay more, I am about to dig for it. And then the next day, published in the paper, "Gentlemen, I have but little to say to the extreme vulgar letter of your correspondent Fair Play, who, like many who assume that title, seems to be adept in false insinuations. If he, as he admits, others discovered gold in this country before Mr. Hargraves, why should he object to let those discoverers claim such merit as he assumes himself? if there be any merit at all in the matter. Mr. Hargraves was not the first person who had arrived at this conclusion, and that instead of 1851, the date of the discovery that gold does exist in this country was many years before, in 1840. Whatever may be a value of Mr. Hargraves' alleged find is to me perfectly indifferent, and if there is the abundance pretended, I may honestly confess that I am sorry for it, because though a few persons may succeed in scraping out of the earth a bag of gold dust, the mischief which would accrue to the colonists for a mania of gold hunting is so fearful to contemplate, with the example of California before our eyes, that no person well disposed to a quiet progress of our social and moral state can desire the dreams of Midas or an Aladdin to be realised. I think it's possible fair play may have overlooked a very important point. At present, the public know nothing about the amount or extent of the goldfield, and nothing of the value of Mr. Hargraves' alleged find. The Columbus egg of that gentleman may perhaps be discovered as an addled one. That is, though there is gold, it may not be as abundant as in California. 2 weeks later, Hargraves himself wrote to the newspaper warning people against the very gold rush he'd effectively started. On the 27th of May, another letter in the paper: "Gentlemen, have passed on my road from Bathurst from 800 to 1,000 people who are off to the diggings, to say nothing of the inability of a great portion of these people to endure the necessary labour to obtain gold. Not 10% of the whole have any tools to work with, or a single pound to support themselves during their journey. Gold digging is very hard work. The season of the year is against carrying on operations in mining. A few hours' rain would put an entire stop to diggings, as the creek rises many feet in a single hour. I regret exceedingly to hear many poor people have left their employment for the purpose of seeking their fortune in the precarious occupation of gold digging. I venture to predict a very small percentage will do good, and a very great amount of human misery must be the result of this reckless digging mania. I may take this opportunity of saying, with reference to remarks said to have emanated from Reverend W.B. Clarke as to prior claims of discovery of gold, that I never had the slightest idea of any such discovery if it ever took place. Time will prove the correctness of statements of yours obediently, Edward Hammond Hargraves." And on the 30th of May, another letter in the newspaper written by Edward Hargraves. "In yesterday's Herald it appeared a statement signed by W.B. Clarke to the effect that Mr. Clarke had long declared that there was gold in this country, but nobody believed him, and that I was guided to the localities which I discovered the gold by his published statement. On the first part of his statement I know nothing, but I most emphatically declare the last statement to be untrue. It may be possible to betray ignorance on my part to say so, but to the best of my belief I have never heard of the Reverend W.B. Clarke of St Leonard's Parsonage until within the last few weeks. I have no desire to acquire notoriety, neither do I take myself much credit for the discovery. It was a result of observation and reflection and perseverance. I mentioned my belief of the existence of gold in this colony to several of my most esteemed and sincere friends upon my return. From the best and kindest motives they endeavoured to dissuade me from the enterprise, but feeling that I could not rest until I satisfied my mind by personal search, I went through hundreds of miles of solitary wilderness, and having made the discovery, disclosed it to the colonial government, who may or may not reward me for the unbounded wealth which I have, through an overruling providence, being the humble instrument of conferring on my fellow colonists." Edward Hammond Hargraves, Sydney. The real truth seems to be that Hargraves was a smart self-publicist and an opportunist, and who perhaps saw the value wasn't in the gold itself, but the awareness of its presence and securing official recognition. E.W. Rudder wrote a book in 1861 titled "Incidents Connected with the Discovery of Gold in New South Wales," and it does show some bitterness had arisen on his side too, suggesting that Mr. Hargraves forgot his friends in the intoxication of his success. And Rudder went on to say, "I lay no claim to the discovery of gold in Australia. I claim to have laid its foundation, to have been its promulgator and the first demonstrator of the most simple and efficient method of procuring it. My object is not to lessen any real merit due to Mr. Hargraves as the actual discoverer of deposits in New South Wales, but that gentleman has absorbed within himself not only that to which he is justly entitled, but to which was due to others, never having, as far as I know, acknowledged the assistance he received and has kept their services in the background." So what is he referring to there about not acknowledging the assistance he received? Well, after starting out at the Macquarie River, Lister and Tom, the two men, decided to try their luck at the junction of Lewis Ponds and Summerhill Creeks. William Tom had heard about the nugget reputedly found there by the shepherd Delaney. After the men had secured their horses and eaten, they began searching the creek bed. A few minutes later, on the rock bar below the junction, which was later called Fitzroy Bar, a gold nugget was found by William Tom Jr. The next day, the cradle was fetched from its hiding place and put into use. And they said that we carried the soil about 30 yards in 2 3-bushel bags, and in consequence could not keep the rocker in motion over about 5 hours each day. By the end of the 3 days, enough gold had been obtained to satisfy them that the ground would pay for working. Before returning home, the two men decided to search further down the creek, where Lister picked up a 2-ounce gold nugget snared in a tree root. In total, 4 ounces of gold had been obtained, including a 3/5 ounce nugget, a 1/4 ounce heart-shaped nugget, and a 1 ounce of fine gold. On the 4th of April, Edward received a letter from William Tom saying that they'd found 16 grains of gold in a yard or two by using the cradle on Lewis Ponds Creek. Edward answered the letter immediately, giving further instructions on how to use the cradle, and asked them to keep the location secret. Edward then went to Brisbane Water to await the government's reply. This was the first time he'd been home in almost 2 years. While there, he carried out some prospecting trips, but the country was all sandstone. While on one of these trips, the letter from the Colonial Secretary with the government's answer arrived, and he returned to Sydney on the 24th of April. On the same day, he received news about the 4 ounces of gold at Yorkie's Corner, and Edward showed Dees Thompson this letter as further proof of a payable goldfield. Edward must have received some assurances from the government of their willingness to reward him, as on the 29th of April, the Sydney Morning Herald reported, "Recent intelligence would lead to the inference that there is something in the alleged discovery of gold in the Western Districts." On the 30th of April, Edward officially wrote to the government giving Lewis Ponds and Summerhill Creeks, Macquarie and Turin Rivers in the districts of Bathurst and Wellington as the location of the goldfield, and added that he was awaiting His Excellency's pleasure as to the mode of testing the value of my discovery. He asked for a loan of £30 to buy a horse, as his had been injured in a fall on the Macquarie. The governor now wrote to Edward and Stutchbury, the government geologist, to arrange for them to meet to validate the goldfield. This presented a problem. Edward knew that washing a couple of pans in front of Stutchbury may yield not much or nothing. If the goldfield was to be endorsed at all, there needed to be a large digging population on the field, and publicity was the key. And this is probably the gist of a notice that was posted up in Brisbane Water by Edward and forwarded to the government by Commissioner Osborne on the 6th of May. Edward hurried back to Guyong, and on the 4th of May he went with Lister and William Tom to the goldfield at Yorkie's Corner, which he now named Ophir. The name is biblical, from the supposed source of King Solomon's gold, although Ophir in California, which was named in 1850 during the gold rush there, may have influenced Hargraves. Some writers have suggested that Tom Brothers' father, William, a Wesleyan lay preacher, coined the name as he knew intimately the wording of the Old Testament. Hiram brought gold from Ophir, and they came to Ophir, and they fetched from thence gold. Phrases describing the city where King Solomon obtained his wealth. At Springfield, the home of the Toms, the 4 ounces of gold were shared equally between the four. Hargraves then purchased the shares of his 3 partners, telling them they would be represented equally to the government. The bar where Tom had found a nugget was called Fitzroy Bar in honour of the governor. Because the Toms and Lister were worried that new diggers might jump their claim, Edward now gave them authorisation that gave the Australian Gold Company the rights to Fitzroy's Bar, Hargraves' Bar, Lister's Bar and Tom's Bar, which proved to be a rich area. Edward, of course, had no such authority, but it afforded the group some protection from the influx that he intended to precipitate. When Enoch Rudder arrived the following day, Hargraves asked him to purify some of the gold and make a specimen that would better impress the governor. On the 8th of May, Hargraves staged a meeting with prominent citizens of Bathurst at James Arthur's Carrier's Arms Inn with the intention of making public his discovery and exhibiting the gold specimens, including the manufactured nugget. 3 days later, accompanied by the government geologist Samuel Stutchbury, he was on his way back to Ophir to prove that gold existed there in abundance, and Hargraves washed 21 grains of fine gold in 3 hours. Suitably impressed, Stutchbury wrote in pencil, apologising that no ink was available yet in the city of Ophir, a letter to the Colonial Secretary dated 19th of May 1851, stating that gold had been obtained in considerable quantity, The number of persons at work and about the diggings, that is occupying about 1 mile of the creek, cannot be less than 400 of all classes. I fear, unless something is done very quickly, that much confusion will arise in consequence of people setting up claims. Edward then went to Bathurst and reached there on the 6th of May. At Mr. Arthur's Inn, Edward explained how to mine for gold, but showed them then the 4 ounces that he'd bought from Tom Brothers and Lister, and said that he thought pieces of 30 or 40 pounds of weight would be discovered. He named where the gold discoveries had taken place, but refrained from passing an opinion on the richness of the field, as this would be a matter of actual trial. The next day he went to Cooming to meet Stutchbury and gave Isley the 4 ounces of gold to take to the government. Referring to Stutchbury's visit, the Bathurst Free Press reported on the 17th of May, "The fact of the existence of gold is therefore clearly established, and whatever credit may arise therefrom, Mr. Hargraves is certainly the individual to whom it properly belongs." Hargraves had succeeded, and Australia's first gold rush had begun. On the 17th of May, the following advertisement appeared in the Bathurst Free Press. "Gold notice. All information respecting the gold region may be obtained at Mrs. Lister's, Guyong. John Lister." A letter dated the 19th of May 1851 was composed by Hargraves and forwarded to John Lister for him to sign. Hargraves also requested Lister send the letter to the Sydney Morning Herald for publication. Hargraves hoped with Lister's signature the letter would prove, once and for all, that he was sole discoverer of the gold and would put any rest of claims made by the Tom Brothers and Lister. "Gentlemen, a report has been spread abroad by some malicious person who evidently is jealous of Mr. Hargraves' great discovery, to the effect that I was the party who made it and communicated it to him. I beg leave most unreservedly to contradict this false report, although having been upwards of 2 years searching for it, at one time with 2 geologists and a mineralogist, who told me there were indications but could not find the gold. Mr. Hargraves, during his explorations, called on me as an old friend of my late respected father, and in course of conversation he told me this was a gold country, and if I would keep a secret, he would combine with me. This I agreed to. He was as good at his word, and scarcely ever made a failure. Where he said gold was to be found, he found it. I neither understand geology or mineralogy, but I was convinced my friend Mr. Hargraves knows where and how to find gold, and all honour and reward in the late discovery belongs to him alone. Indeed, few men would have done what he has, intersecting the country with blacks, sometimes alone, sometimes with my friend Mr. James Tom, and during his explorations, had rain set in from the imperfect manner in which he was equipped, starvation and death may have been the result. Trusting you will give this publicity in the columns of your valuable journal. I am, gentlemen, your most obedient servant, John Hardman Lister. P.S. I have also heard it reported that Mr. Hargraves has not acted fairly towards me. I beg most distinctly to state that all transactions with that gentleman, he has acted strictly honourably with me and friends in the secret of the great discovery. Mr. Hargraves is no longer connected with me or my party at Ophir, and wherever he may go he has my best wishes, and I believe of all who have known him in the district of Bathurst." Lister declined to sign the letter, which was published in the Bathurst Free Press in January 1852, along with Lister's comments on the subject. "I could not subscribe my name to the untruths it contained. I also assert, in plain words, that Mr. James Tom and I never travelled with Mr. Hargraves with any other understanding than that we were his prospecting colleagues and concerned equally with himself in any favourable results that might accrue from our journeys." Edward arrived back in Sydney on the 22nd of May 1851 to pursue his cause. On the 3rd of June, the Executive Council voted him a reward of £500, appointed him as a Commissioner of Crown Lands with the express duty of discovering new goldfields. Edward was disposed not to accept what seemed insufficient, but agreed when it was pointed out to him that the government service could increase his reward. In the meantime, the government had dithered. No less a person than the American consul in Sydney had told Thompson that the gold must be Californian, as the mountains in New South Wales were not high enough for gold to exist there. There were also suspicions that Edward was perpetrating a fraud, as his gold was pronounced by a Californian miner to be from the Yuba and Feather River diggings. However, all doubts were swept aside by Stutchbury's letter on the 22nd of May. Governor Fitzroy, who had delayed any decisions regarding regulating the goldfield, now allowed the introduction of licences, and the Colonial Secretary organised officials to carry out the policy and a police escort to maintain order. The Tom brothers and Lister, disappointed and angry, began the long process of lobbying the government for recognition, and this would endure for 40 years. William Tom had written to the Colonial Secretary, Dees Thompson, on the 6th of June 1851, but the reply was anything but encouraging. Hargraves had failed to make any mention of his partners. Again, on the 22nd of December, Tom wrote a letter, but at this time it was addressed to Governor Fitzroy. The letters contained the brothers Tom and Lister versions of the facts of the discovery and emphasised that they were considered prospecting colleagues of Mr. Hargraves and that we are not altogether unwarranted in requesting some remuneration from the government for the expense we of necessity incurred in developing one of the richest pecuniary resources of the colony. These letters were published in the Bathurst Free Press on the 1st of January 1853. In part 3, I will outline what Hargraves did with himself after the gold discovery and also how successful the Tom brothers and Lister were in obtaining some reward for their work.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.